Welcome to episode 117 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. I am fortunate to be in a position in which I receive many books sent to me each month. One such book I received a little earlier in the year was called Made for Learning: How the Conditions of Learning Guide Teaching Decisions. The authors are Debra Crouch and Brian Cambourne. The way this dynamic author duo came to be is a great story by itself, one that we will actually hear a little bit about in just a few minutes. But more than that, Debra and Brian have put together a book that will allow us as educators to better leverage the teaching and learning process. There are 8 conditions of learning that our authors have identified. Today, we are joined by Debra Crouch, who will go into a little more detail, not just on the conditions of learning, but how they are intricately connected to one another. Debra, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to not just have you on the podcast, but to talk more about this book. And I'm not even going to get into that yet because we've got other things we have to take care of first. But I know that I've had discussions with you as you're getting ready to prepare for a presentation with Maryland ASCD, and then I've had an opportunity to talk to you just kind of like a pre-planning thing for this. And so all of that, I say, has built me up in anticipation of today's conversation. I'm excited for the listeners to learn more about Made for Learning. But before we do that, before we get started, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, so I love the phrase anchored in education because that just really does talk about the grounding, doesn't it? So I'm just going to start by saying, I didn't actually have those dreams of being a teacher until I was the teacher, which is a little bit weird. I was a psychology major. And then when I graduated, I was searching around trying to figure out how to get a job and did that sort of thing. And so I got a job working at a daycare center, and I absolutely fell in love with working with children. And so I just became a teacher in that way. And I became the kindergarten teacher at that center by default because I was the only one with my degree, which was the only thing that the state was requiring at the time. And so, since I was the only one who could fill that role, that became my job. And so I just got really excited about learning more about how to do it well. And so I decided that would be my path. And I went back and got my master's in early childhood education. And a couple of my professors there were really strong proponents of reading professionally. And so they had us in books and articles and all of this. And that became a habit for me. And so I continued that professional reading after, I finished my degree and got my job in public schools. And I've just never stopped. And so that's really how I got to be anchored in education. And then one of the things that I thought was so powerful was I came across a book called The Whole Story, which was Brian Cambourne's first book about the conditions of learning. And that book and Brian's theory of learning, it really changed my entire view of how I saw myself as an educator, whether that was in my classroom when I was working with little kids or whether it's in my work now where I am supporting the adult learners. And I think that theory really helped me to distinguish and understand the difference between teaching and helping someone learn. And that has really anchored my work so much because I feel like in education, we spend a lot of our time thinking about what a teacher does, and everything starts with the teacher, right? It's first and foremost about, the teacher, and learning is just simply the outcome of that teaching. And I think the conditions of learning for me, it really grounded me and helped me understand and appreciate that learning is, first of all, it's something that's always happening to a learner. It's always happening because that's how the brain is made. And that teaching has to be a response to that learner. And so, when we think about the title of our book, learners are literally made for learning.
Yeah.
And so, just say Brian and his theory really, they have grounded and been the anchor for me throughout my entire career. And they say that old saying about never meet your heroes. Well, in this case, getting to meet and work and think with Brian has been it's just changed the way that I operate professionally, I would say.
Yeah.
But that's my anchor story.
I love that anchored story. And, I often say, like, oh, you never want to meet your hero. So to hear a success story of you meet your hero, and not only do you get to meet them, but then you get to collaborate with them and kind of expound on it more. And so that brings us right into the book that you co-authored with Brian Cambourne called Made for Learning: How the Conditions of Learning Guide Teaching Decisions. And, we'll get into what the focus is, but what I love about it is that the book starts with Brian's story, and then it goes into what your story is. And I think that what a neat way to see where the conditions of learning came from, and then how the two of you came together. So the conditions of learning is our focus today. Why don't we start by learning more about these conditions of learning, what they are, and what was the driver behind their development?
Okay, so the conditions of learning, it's a theory. It's a theory of learning, and it describes the physical, the social, the emotional, and the intellectual settings and spaces in which learning is more likely to occur. And so it all began with Brian, and he was a young teacher himself, and he was really curious about why some of the kids in his class, no matter what he did, just didn't seem to learn what he was trying to teach them. And he said, yet outside the classroom, he could see them using really sophisticated thinking and language to problem solve as they would interact with kids in different games that they were playing. And he said, so, obviously there was nothing wrong with the kids. Had to be something about the teaching, right? And so when he went to work on his doctorate, he chose to study how we learn. He made that his focus for his dissertation. And so he decided, as he would study, he wanted to look at some type of universal learning. And so what he chose was to learn how children learn to talk. And cognitive scientists will tell you that this is the most complex learning that we ever do in our lives. And we do it when we're the most cognitively immature.
Sure.
Right? Which, perfect place to start, right? And so one of the things that, was so powerful is that Brian chose this universal learning. And it is universal, that every child, unless there are physical challenges or emotional challenges like abuse, they will learn the language or languages in which they're immersed. I mean, that's a universal, and there are no conditions on that. Okay, so it happens. And so Brian set out and he began to spend, what ended up being years listening in and observing as very young children interacted with their caregivers. And his goal was to see if he could identify patterns that existed across these different learning situations, right? And I think it's really important to note, because this always struck me about his research, that he was using a naturalistic inquiry paradigm, which means he was more like an anthropologist than the way educational research tends to happen. He was going in to observe what was there and then describing what he saw to find the patterns that existed. He didn't go into his research to think about a cause and effect. If I do this to students, to a learner, what will I get? And so a lot of educational research is like that. And so what he found was that over time, he could tease out different patterns that he found across all of these children who were learning to talk, and he termed those the conditions of learning. So then, to connect his learning and thinking to the classroom, he asked classroom teachers if they would put those same conditions into their learning settings so that he could see how this affected literacy learning. Did it transfer? Did you see that happening in a classroom? And what he found after all of those years, we're talking like 15, 16 years of study, was that those same conditions that make learning to talk happen so consistently are also making reading and writing happen consistently in classrooms that apply the conditions of learning.
And when you talk about the reading and literacy, and that's what your background was as well.
Yes, I have focused my efforts really in the literacy area. And I think part of that is just that this is a passion for me. I know reading and writing are just tools for all kinds of learning. So I know they were important to me as a young learner, as an adult to this day. So yeah, I focused my efforts on literacy. But you'll see these same kinds of conditions when you read in the areas of math, science, social studies, history, all of that. These conditions are they're really a very universal kind of way of approaching looking at learning.
Yeah, and that's what I want listeners to understand, is that you can really put this into any content area, because it's not just specific to read. You can put it anywhere. I mean, that's why it's called Made for Learning, not Made for Reading, right? And but so now I want to get into some of the conditions of learning more in depth. And so what I want readers or listeners to understand is that while Made for Learning, and even this episode, we'll talk about the conditions of learning separately, they are in fact interconnected with one another. And what I love in the book is that it shows very well, like, I don't know if you'd call it a web or schematics or something on how they connect together. But so we'll do our best to visualize that through our words today on this podcast. Let's begin with immersion and demonstration. Can you speak to us more about those two as a condition of learning?
Yeah, you're right, Scott, because these conditions, and there are 8 of them that Brian identified, they function like an ecosystem. So if you can think of it in that way, where
that is a great way to put it. Yes,
it absolutely is. When you think about how when we affect one thing in an ecosystem, it in turn affects all the others. So there's a real synergy and kind of holistic nature to the way these conditions work together. So the 2 conditions you mentioned, immersion and demonstration, are a real critical piece of this. Immersion is when someone witnesses an experience of what it is that's being learned, right? And that whole experience, they're witnessing that experience, it really helps a learner to understand the full effects of what's being learned. So you can see the outcomes of what happens when you behave and do certain things, when you speak in certain ways. And that really, as they're immersed in an experience, it helps the learner to experience all of the physical and the social and the emotional and the intellectual aspects of whatever it is that you're learning. So, for example, when young children are learning to speak, when they make a babble, when they start off babbling, they experience the effect of that utterance. They experience what happens when someone responds to what they have uttered. And there's often an action to go along with it. So it's very immediate. It's very relevant to the learner. And so this little child, they see how the sound that they make is connected and influences what happens next in the world. And, in the classroom, I think about examples of immersion are things like reading aloud to children. Because when we read aloud to children, we surround them with story language so that they experience the kinds of emotional and visceral responses to books that readers have, that depth of reading that we talk about. But the challenge in our classrooms is without immersion, the bits and the pieces of reading just don't always connect for readers. So this is that kind of big understanding, that sort of base of what goes on in a classroom. Now, a demonstration, one thing to know is all learning begins with these demonstrations. It always begins with this. Demonstrations are those artifacts and those actions that help the learner understand and recognize what's happening in that immersive experience. And it supports the learner to apply all the different skills and the behaviors and the knowledge that the teacher, if you will, is sharing, the more learned other is sharing with them. So in a sense, that immersion in those demonstrations are what really provide the context for what is being learned.
You know, Debra, I'm thinking back to whenever my son, who 17 years old, going to be a senior this year, just hard to believe. But I'm thinking back to when he
Yes.
was 2 or 3, and we would always read a story at night. And I wish to save my life I could remember the name of this book, but it involved going to a party and everything else. And so what I'm wondering is, if that very well could have been immersion and demonstration, as I'm reading that every night. And then I noticed that, you know, because of the repetition, I mean, that was the go-to book, that he began reading along. But I know that, you know, he wasn't reading the words. He was simply, you know, going back to mimicking what he's heard, or what I see is, after the immersion, demonstrating, you know, the very similar things. Am I on the right path as far as what immersion demonstration looks like?
You are. I mean, I think, you know, when we think about immersion and demonstration, when you think about that social and that emotional and that intellectual environment that you're creating, because my picture as you're talking about this is you're also kind of snuggled up together.
We are, yeah.
Because that, you know, that physical and that emotional bonding that happens between a parent and a child during that read aloud, it really is what starts you on what we term engagement, which is another one of the conditions we're going to talk about in a minute. It's that understanding that these are behaviors, these are experiences that are joyful, that are meaningful, because you're thinking about all of the ways that you're bringing in your stories from your life. You know, children talk about the connections that they make when they read stories with their parents. You know, their parents are pointing out things, drawing their attention to things that are really relevant for understanding. And one of the things that we know is that all of that work that we do about the word level, that has to lead, you have to know where that's going to take you, if that's going to be purposeful for you at all. And that's sometimes, I think, one of the challenges sometimes is that we've got to make sure that all of this is present. Like, one isn't more important at some point in children's lives than the other. But it's like, if we don't have that big understanding of the purpose of all of that print, then it doesn't really mean as much to us.
Yeah.
And we can be the very compliant kid. We can be the ones who perform, you know, for the teacher, who, you know, we go right into it, and we are, you know, we can get the good grades even, but not necessarily does it turn us into the literate people that we know it takes to be, you know, in our world today.
Yeah. And when you say the word compliant, the one thing that doesn't come to mind is another word that you used just a minute ago, which is engagement. And so moving right into the next condition of learning. Now, the first two that we talked about, immersion and demonstration, they have to be accompanied by engagement. And so it's funny, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. I was a guest on a podcast last week, and we were talking about engagement. And we said, man, everybody throws that word around, but you know, you ask a room full of people, 20 people, you get maybe 20 different definitions. We've heard it to describe learning and education. You and Brian in the book say, quote, engagement is fundamental to learning. But you don't stop there. You go on to say, quote, it's complex and difficult to define. Amen. So let's spend a moment talking about engagement, what it is, what it isn't, and as well as how it operates as a condition of learning.
Yes, it's an interesting term, because I can't pass up an article that has engagement in the title.
Yeah,
I know it's about
same.
engagement. I'm going to read it. And it's an interesting dynamic, because oftentimes it is described by the external behaviors of a learner. And I think one of the things about engagement and really the conditions, in a sense, it's really more about an internal state. So when we think about engagement, we think of it as the central piece of these conditions. And our visual that we created in the book, we put engagement at the center.
Yeah,
and that's simply
big.
because it is so fundamental to learning. So we know as teachers, we can have the very best lessons. We could check all the boxes off on having this great lesson plan and lesson design, but we know if we don't have children who are engaged with what we're doing, then you're not going to actually have learning happen. Now, they can be interested in the topic because there are many things that I'm interested in, but I don't see myself actually becoming, right? And that's one of the sort of key elements of engagement, is that you have to see yourself as a doer of what it is that you're witnessing. So in that immersion, in those demonstrations, you have to see yourself as part of that, as someone who can either learn it or become it, with a little, with your work. When Brian talks about engagement, when he was doing his research, he defined engagement as a set of principles that are present in the learner. And again, they're intertwined as well. And they are, first and foremost, this way of thinking about an internal stance that learner has. Okay. So the first one I mentioned there is that you see yourself as a doer. Mm-hmm. That is absolutely critical. Do you see yourself as someone who can learn what it is that's there and presented to you? So children see the effect of their speech, and suddenly they see themselves. They are doers of that, of language, and being these true communicators. So in a classroom, the same is true. The learner has to see themselves as a reader or a writer or a mathematician or a scientist or a historian. They have to see that as something that is within their realm. The second principle is understanding how all of those demonstrations, those holistic demonstrations, are important to your life. How are they going to make a difference for me? And those demonstrations, when they're meaningful and meaning-based and relevant, it makes the learner a lot more likely to engage with them. A third principle is that the learner feels really free from any physical or psychological harm, that nothing's going to happen to me if I try out learning something. So I'm not going to have the physical danger. Sometimes people are big risk takers and they see themselves in that way. Others don't see themselves in that way. But also that psychological harm, that if I try something, I won't be demeaned for trying it. One of the conditions we're going to talk about in a moment is approximation, and it connects so tightly into this. A learner has to trust that they're not going to be harmed by trying something. It's just a bottom line as a principle. And then that fourth principle goes to that teacher-child relationship. The learner has to like and trust and respect and want to emulate the person that's doing the demonstration, right? So we talk so much in the professional literature about how important that relationship is, and this is why, because it is a critical part of engagement. And you can't learn from someone that you don't trust or that you don't respect. And so that's such a critical part of learning. And again, we can talk about those principles separately too, but really they all function. And you can see how if you affect one, you're going to be affecting all the others as well.
Oh, yeah. So much to unpack just about engagement. And I mean, I'm guessing this is why, anytime that it's diagrammed here, it's always center and the largest, because it's such a critical piece. And, I can easily tie it back to, you had even said whenever, my analogy of my son and reading as a child, but I'm putting myself back in the junior high classroom, or myself back in the high school classroom as a student. And I can see where you talk about these four principles on where, sadly, some of the teachers miss the mark on engagement. And because of that, I know that for the longest time, I was thinking that I could not do math, and I'm doing the air quotes, right? I couldn't do math. But I wonder, as I look now, like I'm pretty decent at math. I enjoy statistics. I wonder if, possibly the engagement piece was missing, and for the condition of learning. And if I'm hearing the principles correctly, I'm thinking that maybe you'll agree with me on that.
I think so. And I think if we don't see ourselves as doers, like if,
Yeah.
and I think we can see ourselves as good students, because I was the teacher pleaser. I mean, I love school. I
Hmm.
love, I'm the straight A student. I, absolutely love going to school, never missed a day.
Yeah. I was
Um,
the exact
but,
opposite.
I think back and I think, I don't know that I ever truly saw myself with any sort of independence and agency. I
Mm,
could do what was expected of me. But in terms of seeing myself, say, as a mathematician or as a historian, I don't even know if I understood what those terms meant. It was just
sure.
doing what the teacher assigned you. And you can again go through an entire K-12 experience and not really truly be the person who sees themselves with that kind of ability, with that engagement stance. And it's scary because we can be the very students. I mean, I was one, got
Hmm.
the good grades, loved school, had nothing but great things to say about my teachers. But at the same time, I don't think that I was prepared for the world. I mean, my math abilities are really scary. I think, once they get much past the, you know, adding and subtracting. Um, but I'm like you. I don't
Yeah.
know that I was ever asked to think of myself in that way.
Yeah. Deborah, I wonder if I could put you on the spot real quick since we're talking about engagement. After you kind of were exposed to conditions of learning, how did you see your engagement as a teacher change as you learned more about it?
It was an absolutely fascinating experience because it wasn't an overnight change,
Oh, sure.
but it was that beginning to realize that the conditions of learning, especially engagement, gave me a way of looking at what was happening in my classroom and what was happening with students, um, and just recognizing that if I did things in certain ways, the kids would respond in certain ways. And so it really gave me a way of analyzing my practice. It gave me language to describe my practice. And I think that was really critical because before that, I think I would have said, I'm a teacher and this is, what I have to do. And I would have been a follower of programs and that sort of teacher. But because I understood that it was about learning and my work was about helping the students learn, I started more from the students. It was like, okay, this is what I'm seeing from my kids. So what should I do in response to that? What do I do in certain ways? What language can I use that helps the kids to see themselves more as doers, that helps them to understand the purpose?
Hmm.
There are just so many ways that your language changes as a teacher, when you've got a theoretical place to reason from. And I'm not sure that I understood that when I first began teaching. But again, as I was the kid or teacher, I shouldn't say kid, the teacher who was constantly seeking out professional developments. Like I would go to them and I would say, oh, this one's going to tell me the way, right? And I would come back and I'd try the way that they'd said. And then within a week, I tried to figure it out. And it was like, but I couldn't reason my way through it because I was focusing so much on what I was doing instead of thinking about it through the lens of the kids. If I'm doing something in a certain way, what's going to be the effect on the learner? And if I'm trying to support the learner to see themselves in certain ways, what can I do that will support that?
Yeah, I think, and we can all share in your experience of going and learning something and coming back and implementing and then being just so frustrated when, it seems so easy sitting and listening
Mhm.
to a speaker, which is why, I mean, we'll continue, but that's why people need to probably go to this episode's page and click on the link to buy Made for Learning so they can understand a little bit more. And so now, at this point in the conversation, you can see how nice the first three connect. And you got, your immersion, demonstration, and then you have that engagement. So now that gives us our first three conditions of learning. Now we shift to the five conditions that
Mhm.
increase the probability of engagement. And so the 5 are expectation, responsibility, employment, approximation, and response. Will you help the listener understand how each of these 5 conditions are vital to the success of learners?
Yeah, and it's so difficult to even talk about the first 3, right? Conditions without also talking about the 5. So I've actually mentioned them already. These 5 conditions are the 5 that make engagement more likely to occur. And we talk about them in the book as setting the tone or the climate or the culture of that learning space. They shape a lot of the possibilities when you think about that learning setting, what is possible. And when Brian was listening in on those interactions with the children who were learning to talk and their caregivers, these became sort of these critical elements that would make or kind of almost make or break whether or not engagement. And so they're really relevant to how a classroom functions on a daily basis. So the first one that you mentioned there, expectation. Expectation is about the beliefs about a learner's capabilities. And it's both how the adult views the learner, but also how the learner views themselves. Okay? And so it comes at it from both angles. And again, tying straight to that condition of, or that principle of engagement about that teacher-child relationship, right? Learners really expect, or they achieve what's expected of them, right? So when he was doing his research, I've always loved this story. He would interview the caregivers and he would talk to them about their expectations for their children learning to talk. And so you can imagine the looks that he got when he said, do you expect your child to learn to talk? And he said they would look at me really funny and think, aren't you supposed to be this smart guy from the university, right? And he said, but they would always say, of course, they're going to learn to talk.
Yeah.
And when he would then move to say, do you think your child will learn to read? They would say things like, well, I hope so. Or, well, if they get a good teacher. And he said what he began to realize was that there's a difference in those comments. Of course, is very unconditional, whereas if is a very conditional kind of expectation. So he said, that's really a powerful piece of whether or not that learner sees themselves as a doer of what it is that we're learning. So when you think about a classroom, we often put conditions on the interactions that we have with kids. When we think about using language like the low group or the high group, right? I mean, we put different kinds of expectations in there. And there is a lot of research, and we cite up quite a bit of this in our book, about the effects of that kind of language and the ways that we then turn around and treat the students. And, we know so much about that. This condition of engagement, this condition of expectation are so tightly together. We always talk about having high expectations, but oftentimes that in our head becomes about standards, which is not what this is talking about at all.
Right.
So it's a lot about beliefs. So that's a really clear condition. It connects next into the condition of responsibility. Now, this is a condition about the learner making decisions about what we're learning. And I think about it in that notion of they are experiencing all of the kinds of what, why, how, when, where kinds of thinking that go on when you're learning how to do something. And this is also where choice comes in. It's just tightly tied to expectations. Do I set up an environment that supports children to make the choices that learners make in order for them to try out what it is that we're learning, which is going into this next condition, which is employment. That's the term that we use for practice. And one of the things that we know is that it takes a lot of time to get good at something. You got to have a lot of practice at what it is that is being demonstrated for you. So learners have to have time, they have to have opportunities to take responsibility, make the choices, try out what you're demonstrating. When children are learning to talk, they are talking all the time, right? So they're getting a lot of practice. And the same has to be true with literacy. Oftentimes what we're doing is we're not giving kids enough time to make choices and independently read, independently write, so that we can give them opportunities to get good at this.
Yeah.
So the next condition is approximation, which we talked about. And this is where a learner's trying out what it is that's being learned. And what we know is that when we think about this condition, that we talk a lot today about mistakes, that how it's okay to make mistakes. Well, the reason that it's so okay is that approximation or mistakes are something that every learner has to go through. And what we have to hold in our heads as the more experienced learner is that those approximations are temporary. We know that the learner will not be making the same kinds of mistakes later on as they are now. So we give them the time and the experience knowing that they're going to get stronger, that they're going to achieve more if we just give them those opportunities to practice and try things out. And the ways that we reveal that belief in them as learners is through our response, which is that fifth condition.
Yeah.
The response that a learner gets from the others that surround them, and that's not just the teacher, the adult teacher, but it's also the other children that are there in the classroom. The way that that learner experiences response to what they try is critical to whether or not they're going to keep trying. Because if you're shut down, if someone's telling you didn't do a good job or that's not the right way to do it, you're going to give up pretty quickly. And so one of the things that we know is that response is such a critical part of a condition of learning. And these five kind of work together to make sure that engagement is more likely to be present for the immersion and demonstrations that we provide.
Yeah, and I know that it was a lot throwing all five of these conditions at you at once, but what I noticed as you took us through each of those five is that you also allowed us to see how these work in concert with each other and all point back to engagement. And because you can easily see if you're missing, really any of these five, but even if you're missing all five, then you don't have your engagement there. And if you don't have your, then it all backs up the wrong way. So I definitely love that we got an opportunity to learn more about those conditions of learning that kind of wrap up the rest of them. So Debra, before we go, learning more about the conditions of learning has been valuable in and of itself, but the last three chapters of Made for Learning give us more on how language is the bridge between learning and teaching, the processes that empower learning, and how to effectively use this theory of learning to guide our own practice. How about we wrap up today's conversation learning a little bit more on what to expect from these chapters and how it helps tie up the theories and concepts that serve as the framework of this book.
Yeah, these last three chapters are really helping us to think about language and again, as you said, how it's a bridge. And one of the things that we do is we define language as being more than just about words. We talk about them being as well as written and oral language, but it's also a lot of the nonverbal kinds of interactions that we have. And one of the things that I think makes that so critical is that we all operate with the verbal kind of communication. That's what we do because we're literacy people. But one of the things that we know is that so much of the ways that we experience other people around us is so critical to how we interpret what it is that's being said. And so just like recognizing that the ways that language and again, verbal and nonverbal language is used is really critical to whether or not those conditions are present in classrooms and how a learner begins to see themselves in that setting. One of the things that we include in our final chapters are some templates that show how you can use these conditions to analyze classroom practices and then those different decisions that are being made through that lens and analyze them through the lens of the conditions of learning. And so this is really how we think about using a theory to inform those day-to-day decisions that happen in a classroom. I think one of the things that we tried to do in the book was to tell a lot of classroom stories, because
yes.
One of the things that we know is that we want to illustrate what classrooms look and sound and feel like, not only for the children, but also for the teachers, when those conditions of learning are operating. But again, we know that there can be classroom spaces where, we can have literacy experiences going on, but we don't necessarily have learning happening. A lot of kids, they have these rich, meaningful literacy experiences that bring the conditions to life, and then other classrooms just don't. The children just don't have those experiences. And so I think Brian and I wrote the book because, we truly believe, and I am I would say I'm the evidence of it, of how when a teacher understands and applies the conditions of learning, whether it's working with children or young children, or whether it's working with adult learners, when we understand and can apply the conditions, we're going to really make or break what ultimately is possible for the learners that we are supporting.
Absolutely. I think the inclusion of the stories throughout the book really brought even more legitimacy to what you're talking to the readers about with the conditions of learning. And, more importantly, it allows you to see the theory in practice. And I think that to know that this will work if we put this into our classrooms, it's huge. And I think that, when you talk about the templates and the resources, I would be remiss if I did not give a shout out to Richard Owen, publisher of Richard Owen Publishing Incorporated, that he's been supportive, I know, in this project, and allowing you and Brian to put in the stories that you did, the resources that you did. I don't know. I think that it's phenomenal. And like I said, we're linking today. The book is Made for Learning: How the Conditions of Learning Guide Teaching Decisions. Debra, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lovely conversation.
Now, you can read more about Debra on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. You'll also find a link to Made for Learning as well. And here I go once again. Please subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcast. Send it to a friend and have them listen too. And while you're at it, maybe you both can go ahead and rate it and leave a comment for it as well. While Debra and I spent the largest portion of our conversation talking about the conditions of learning, I believe it is important to talk more about the book itself as I close today. The last 3 chapters of Made for Learning dive into more on how the brain is conditioned for learning. Specifically, they have an entire chapter dedicated to language, which, as our authors say, is the bridge between learning and teaching. They also take a deeper dive into processes that empower learning, such as transformation, discussion and reflection, application, and evaluation. They conclude Made for Learning talking about how you can use this theory of learning to guide your own practice. And interspersed throughout most of the chapters are boxes called More to the Story, or mismatch between theory and practice. These snippets allow the reader to acquire an even deeper understanding of what is being presented in the chapter. This is a book I would recommend to any educator at any level. To me, it was an easy read that also led to a lot of reflections on my own personal practice and how I could utilize the conditions of learning to better enhance teaching and learning. Enhancing teaching and learning seems like a great reason to me to remain anchored in education.